Hello. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the INTP stream. Um, I I was watching a video the other day um, about it was some interview and or interaction with an economist, and the subject was raised, or at least the point. One of the things he mentioned while making another point, an unrelated point, is that there's this weird phenomenon of countries that are oil rich, meaning they have very large oil reserves. Um, and yet, despite the fact that they have this super abundant quantity of this extremely lucrative resource, if exploited properly, despite that fact, these countries are poor, right? They suffer from immense poverty. And it just seems ironic that an oil rich country could still have, effectively exploiting, extracting, and exporting this extremely lucrative and valuable resource. It's a little bit puzzling that despite all of the incoming capital from the extraction and exportation of that resource, despite all of that incoming wealth and capital, there are still so many people in those countries that suffer from extreme poverty. And one of these things that happens in these countries is that, or one of the things that you observe, is that there is this, phenomenon of the wealth gap, meaning there's immense economic inequality between the rich and the poor. And so, yeah, and you've got that going on. And, to say that there's a wealth gap, for one thing, but a huge divide between the rich and the poor is ultimately not to say that the country itself is poor, right? A country could, that's one point to be made. A country could have a significant wealth gap and be an extremely rich country. The gap is only the difference between the highest and lowest earners, right? The lowest earner is not necessarily a low earner, and the highest earner, on the other hand, is not necessarily a high earner, right? So the gap will across countries will fluctuate in its position, right? The bottom line of that gap, the lowest earner, the income level at which the lowest earner and the gap begins will vary across countries, right? So it's only to say that just because one could say, if one studied a little bit more in economics, that just because there's a wealth gap doesn't mean the country is suffering from poverty significantly. On the other hand, I could just as easily argue that if there is a significant wealth gap, that the country is largely poor, if we make the assumption that very few people are rich and most people are poor. If there's a wealth gap, there's a significant wealth gap. What that means is, now I'm not sure if that's necessarily a correct point, but regardless, if we assume that much more people are poor than rich, and there's a significant wealth gap, um, then it would just stand to reason that most people would still be poor anyway, and very few people would be rich. Regardless, there's a point to be made there. And obviously, yeah, extracting and exporting this resource does cause through a lot of capital to come in, but that doesn't necessarily. It's not really going into the country. It's going to the corporations that are managing the extraction and exportation of that resource, right? That incoming capital in the chain of benefits that it produces first goes to the corporations that manage the extraction and exportation of that resource, that trade directly with it. The incoming wealth can't have any direct benefit on the poverty level in the country or the poverty levels, but it can fill the pocket of the corporations. And if those corporations reinvest in the local and national economy, that money and value will recirculate, and we'll see more, we'll naturally see more benefits, an increase in overall quality of life for everyone, and perhaps even a shrinkage. Um, in that gap, if that's even possible, if there is significant reinvestment back into the economy, circulation of the incoming capital that comes to the corporations as the result of the extraction and exportation of this resource. And yet, why is it that we have all of this incoming capital as the result of the extraction and exportation of this resource, and yet the country still suffers from such immense poverty, right? It just seems odd. There's a bit of an irony there that I'm detecting. However, I think that at least asking this question got me thinking, and it possibly revealed a relationship or a connection to me that previously I would not have detected if I had not asked the question. So why is it that these countries are oil rich, but so many of their people are money poor? Why is it that these countries that have such an immensely lucrative resource and can effectively exploit, extract, export it, why is it that they also suffer from such immense poverty? And I think what it may have something to do with the fact, one, it could definitely be the case that those corporations that are intercepting all of this incoming capital and wealth, it could be that they're just simply not reinvesting it into the local or national economy. So it's not really recirculating in any way. And so it can't really benefit any of the local businesses or the economic transactors and other corporations and the people in general. Because if there was this incoming wealth, theoretically, if it were reinvested and recirculated into the local or national economy, businesses would have an easier time getting their products bought because there's more wealth to purchase them. That would allow them to generate more wealth for themselves, put out better quality products, which is better for the consumer. But why is it in general? Well, I think what it may have something to do with the reason why these countries are oil rich but money poor, and you have all of this incoming wealth and capital as the result of the extraction and exportation of this resource, but still extreme conditions of poverty, despite the fact that oil is an extremely lucrative resource and valuable resource. There's that irony there. If the countries are so oil rich, why are they money poor? I think what it actually has to do with is their lack of democracy and their lack of sufficient democratic systems that keep elected representatives accountable to the people that elected them. Or simply a lack of transparency about how those elected representatives are transacting with lobbyists and special interests to gain favors or exchange them. So it just seems, I think what it may have something. So imagine this, right? So in these countries, you've got all this incoming wealth and capital, right, from the extraction and exportation of this resource. And it makes people extremely rich, these corporations extremely rich in the process. What is a logical thing for the rich to do with regard to government and policy if they can? It would be to buy politicians. Because if you can buy politicians, you can buy policies that are favorable to your class interests. And so it would be logical that these oil barons begin purchasing politicians to ensure that they're buttressing policies that then ultimately serve their interests monetarily and financially and fiscally. And it may be that it would be a very logical next step and a strategic next step for them to buy politicians, to produce policies that are beneficial to their interests, to ultimately generate more and more and more and more wealth. And if the country is not sufficiently democratic, they don't have sufficient attempts to separate money from politics. They don't have clear media transparency as the fourth branch of government, which keeps the representatives accountable to the people even more. What will happen is these representatives will transact with these oil barons and allow themselves to be purchased by them in an exchange of favors. And those representatives will no longer be accountable to the people that elected them, and will rather simply become a puppet for the interests of those the wealth class made wealthy by the extraction, exploitation of this resource, the oil resource, and the oil reserves under the land. So I think it's probably the reason that these countries have all this incoming capital and yet still have this this extreme wealth gap and extreme poverty is because the countries are not sufficiently democratic. There aren't sufficient attempts to separate money from politics. There is not sufficient transparency. Thus, these oil barons can purchase politicians, and the rich, especially, not just the oil barons, but the rich in these countries, because there isn't sufficient transparency or democracy or attempts to separate money from politics, can buy politicians to serve the interests of the rich and not at the expense, which is funny, at the expense, because we're talking about wealth, at the expense of the poor. And so you could easily see that if the country is not sufficiently democratic, there aren't sufficient attempts to separate money from politics, and there isn't sufficient accountability and transparency with regard to how representatives are evaluated, elected representatives are evaluated by the people that elect them, what will happen is the country could very easily step into a situation or a habit, or the government could, or representatives could easily step into a habit of then becoming purchased by the rich in those countries because there isn't sufficient democracy, there isn't sufficient attempts to separate money from politics. Those politicians then become bought politicians and paid for politicians. And so the policies they produce benefit the rich and don't really do anything to benefit the poor as much, in terms of minimum providing for minimum wage, social welfare programs, fair and equitable taxation, etc. So if we have a country that isn't sufficiently democratic, there isn't sufficient attempts to separate money from politics, then politicians in these countries can be bought by the rich, and thus the country's policies will disproportionately benefit the rich at the expense of the poor. And that will inherently increase the wealth gap and will inherently make the rich richer and not really make the poor any more rich, or could even possibly make the poor more poor. So again, and whereas if you did have sufficient democracy in those countries, if you did have democratic accountability and transparency, if you did have attempts to separate money from politics, then the representatives would not just be beholden to the rich and the upper class, and would make policies that more equitably serve all classes, not just the upper classes, right? There'd be minimum wage, which would then allow people to gain more wealth and move out of poverty. They gain economic mobility. There'd be fair taxation, right, on the rich. More taxes on the rich equal more money to invest in infrastructure and social welfare programs, which also benefit the poor, shrinking the wage gap. That's primarily the thing, the main thing. And otherwise, the wage gap would be shrunk because the rich would be taxed more fairly and the poor more fairly. And so that takes the money from those, distributes the burden of taxation equitably according to the income level. And that would help the economic inequality problem and poverty within those countries as well. So I think it may have something to do with the fact that in these countries that are oil rich, but so many are money poor, despite all of this incoming capital and wealth and reinvestment into the local economy and the national economy, despite that fact they're still poor, is probably because in these countries there isn't sufficient democracies or sufficient attempts to separate money from politics, or there isn't sufficient transparency, and the representatives are not sufficiently accountable to those who elected them. Therefore, they can be bought and they can serve the rich at the expense of those that elected them, which are mostly poor. And if that's the dynamic that occurs, then naturally policies benefit rich, not poor. And that is a starting point for the increase in the wealth gap, making the rich richer and the poor poorer, and everything else that comes with that. So I think what it definitely has to do with, in these countries where there is all of these rich oil reserves and all of these economic inequality problems, I think it likely, despite the fact that there are these they're oil rich and so many are money poor, I think probably has to do with the fact that there just isn't sufficient democracy in these countries or attempts to separate money from politics. So the oil barons that take all this incoming wealth can invest it, partially reinvest it into the local or national economy, but also probably invest in use that money to generate political power for themselves to influence policy in their favor, only enhancing their power in a snowball effect by buying politicians that, in a country without democracy and without sufficient democratic accountability and transparency, are not sufficiently accountable to the people that elected them. Therefore, these politicians can exchange favors with those oil barons and the rich in general. Thus, policies benefit the rich, not the poor, which makes the rich richer, the poor poorer, or at least does not make the rich, or at least does not make the poor more rich, and only makes the rich richer, produces the dynamic that I talked about with the wealth gap. Naturally, if the country's policies are benefiting the rich and not the poor disproportionately, you're going to see an increase in the wealth gap, the rich richer, the poor poorer. And you're most certainly going to see that so in any case, hopefully I've explained that connection clearly enough. It's only to say that, what needs to be instituted into these countries, perhaps these oil-rich countries that are still very money poor in terms of the poverty suffered by millions of people, is they need more democracy. They need more attempts to separate money from politics. Their representatives need to be more democratically accountable, and the media needs to act as a disinfectant to scrutinize those representatives, to ensure they're transparent to the people, to ensure that those representatives are not allowing themselves to be purchased by the rich and collude with the rich to then produce policies that benefit the rich and not the poor, only worsening conditions for the poor and bettering them for the rich, and ultimately then producing the dynamic and you can see how this could happen, right? So if in a country where all of the representatives and the leaders are just purchased by the noble class of the wealth class, right, which is a kind of nobility class from other earlier periods of history, in a way, they're kind of like the nobility that would collude with the leaders and the representatives to gain their favor, and they'd exchange favors at the expense of everyone else. I think that it's pretty clear that if the country's policies are benefiting the rich and not the poor disproportionately, and is only concerned with the interests of the rich and not of all classes, only concerned with the interests of some classes and not others, what will happen? Well, the rich don't want a minimum wage, right? Because often the rich are the corporations and the businesses, and they don't want to have to pay more than they absolutely want to in terms of what they want to make in a profit. So they'll oppose the minimum wage. If the politicians are bought by them, politicians will also oppose the minimum wage, which will then keep the poor poorer because they can't amass higher income as the result that would naturally result from the institution of a minimum wage, which then keeps the poor poor, the rich rich, and that's because the rich don't have to pay the poor that work for them, and the poor can't make any more than whatever the business or the corporation is willing to pay them. So they have no economic mobility then. They're just kind of stuck in these penury wage jobs and penury wage class conditions. And you can see that with taxation. If in this country the politicians are bought by the rich, which could very easily happen, money can be used as a kind of political power, which is why I titled the video "A Vote Per Person or Per Dollar." You could easily see how naturally in that situation, taxes will be low on the rich, so there'll be less government revenue. You can't take much from the poor, so infrastructure will suck, which then also impacts economic mobility. There'll be limited opportunity and whatnot. And then with the rich are obviously going to oppose any program that would increase their tax rate. That includes social welfare programs. So then the politicians bought by the rich would not really support these programs, which would then increase the economic mobility of the poor, because it would hamper the rich and would cost the rich too much for the sake of the poor. So you could kind of see loosely how, in countries where there just isn't sufficient democracy, attempts to separate money from politics, democratic accountability and transparency of elected leaders and representatives, it's very likely that there'll be this rising noble class of of wealthy persons, corporations, businesses, and the rich, which will collude with the representatives and the leaders to then exchange favors. And thus, in these countries where the government is bought, it will support policies that that benefit the rich and not the poor, which will have all of these effects of increasing the wealth gap and making the poor poor and the rich richer, et cetera, et cetera. So there may be some connection between democracy, sufficient democratic accountability and transparency, and attempts to separate money from politics, and rising wealth and economic equality and other economic benefits. In this way, political science and economics is not separate. They hinge upon each other very much. And how we institute our government democratically or whatever, in either way, has effects on the economy and the economic operations of the country and the economic life and the economic destiny of the people. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and hopefully the connection has been explained well enough to be visible. In any case, thank you for watching. Tune in next time. Tune in next time. I've got a fancy microphone now and a little bit more of an interesting setup. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching. Oh, yes. And also like and subscribe. Do both of those two things. That would be absolutely wonderful. Thank you.